Philadelphia is the 6th largest city in the U.S., but it's a city with a surprisingly small-town feel.
People are very proud of their neighborhoods. Historically, Philadelphia has been a real family neighborhood type of city where people often stay in the neighborhood where they grew up in and know their neighbors and have relatives that live close by.
It's in one of these tight-knit communities where 16-year-old Karen Wittes is growing up.
Hey, let me help you.
No. You're gonna be late for school, you better go.
I'll be fine.
Karen was a character, and she was like the apple of my eye, I guess you would say. She never ceased to amaze me. She was just so full of life.
What time are you getting in tonight?
Probably not till later. I have dance practice till about 7, so.
At least get a ride with someone, okay?
It's like 3 blocks away. I'll be fine. Don't worry.
You need to at least walk with one of the girls.
You worry too much, you know that?
I'm a mother. That's my job.
My mom has always been a single mom since the time I was born. But my mom worked a full-time job. She worked so hard to try to give me the best life that she possibly could. It was just, you know, yeah, we were on our own.
I'll see you.
I could trust her. Karen always made right decisions. But Karen is my baby. She'll always be my baby. I'll never stop worrying about her.
In addition to school and dance practice, Karen spends a lot of her time focused on a promising new relationship with high schooler Jeremy DeMann.
Oh. Hey, beautiful.
Hey.
He was different. He was really fun. He was easygoing, and yeah, we enjoyed each other's company a lot.
I missed you so much.
You literally just saw me in 3rd period.
No, I was like 2 whole hours ago. So, what about the history test next week?
No. I don't want to think about it. I'm so far behind.
Oh, no, see, me too. So what if you, me, studying tonight?
I can't. I have dance practice.
I know, but I mean, that ends at like 6. What about after?
I don't know. My mom doesn't like me to stay out late on a school night. You know that.
But it's for school. Come on.
Okay, fine. Okay. We'll do it. But we have to actually study this time, then,
yeah,
okay?
I promise.
Okay.
I promise.
I was very, very happy at that time. I had this new boyfriend. Life was great. But at the same time, I started noticing odd things. I thought maybe it might have been a friend from school who I may have had a disagreement with. I wasn't sure who this could be, but I was incredibly uneasy.
Okay, I think I need to look this up. Hold on.
Later, Karen and Jeremy are hanging out when they are suddenly interrupted.
Who's the new guy? You can do better. What's this? Who gave that to you?
I don't know.
You don't know? You have no idea?
I don't know. It's just trash.
Well, yeah, obviously it's trash. I wanted, you didn't answer the question. I just wanted to know who gave it to you.
I told you, I don't know. But anyways, look, so I was thinking, what about for chapter 6?
No, forget chapter 6. I mean, is one of your friends pissed at me? Did I say something?
You know all of my friends love you.
Okay, so who gave it to you? I know you know. Who gave you the note?
I think it might be Leonard.
Leonard. I thought you guys broke up like a year ago.
We did.
My ex-boyfriend reeled me in, constantly telling me, you know, he loved me, I was beautiful, I was the center of his world. But as time went on, I started seeing a more possessive side.
So his wife dies, and then he ends up on the radio, and that's where she hears him. It's so cute.
Oh my gosh, yeah, no, I've been wanting to see that forever. I've seen all the previews. It looks
Awesome.
great.
Let's go this weekend.
Let's do it. That would be awesome.
Let's do it. I'm so excited.
Yes.
I just wanted to be a kid. I wanted to have friends. I wanted to be a teenager. And it got to the point that I was his and only his.
I've got something for you.
Oh my gosh.
Something for you to think of me when I'm not around.
This is really sweet. Wow, thank you so much. Come here.
All right, well, that's my cue to go. Hey, Saturday night, though.
Yes, definitely.
Awesome.
I'll
See
see
ya.
you there. Hey, what's the matter?
You made plans without me? I thought I told you to always check with me first.
Are you serious? What?
He didn't want me to have any friends. I wanted to have friends. I wanted to be a teenager. And there was no way that he was going to allow that. I had had enough because I needed to be a teenager. I wanted to experience life. I needed to have friends of my own. So finally, we broke up.
Anyways, I don't want to think about him anymore. He's such a creep.
Okay, but he's very clearly thinking about you. I mean, didn't he leave school? Didn't he drop out or something?
Jeremy, I don't...
So how'd he get the note in your backpack?
I don't know, Jeremy. I don't know. But that's just Leonard, okay? He does stuff like this. He knows how to get to me.
Well, maybe you should set better boundaries.
Now that I was able to actually move on and gain this new relationship with my current boyfriend at the time, I was so happy. And the fact that my ex-boyfriend actually came back into my life, there was no bad feelings, but my current boyfriend was kind of leery.
What are you doing, Jeremy?
I'm going. I'm done studying.
Karen does her best to put the incident behind her. And days later, it seems as if life is back to normal.
You look like you need a ride.
Oh, you're still mad at me from the other day.
You know, I tried really hard, and I just couldn't stay mad at you. Hey.
Hey. I missed you.
Yeah? Maybe we should fight more often.
Isn't that sweet?
He would just kind of show up unexpectedly.
What do you want, man?
Hey, relax. I'm Leonard, by the way.
It was kind of like he wanted to be friends again. He wasn't showing any kind of display of, being jealous or anything like that.
Look, Leonard, what are you doing here?
I just wanted to see you before I left.
Where are you going?
I'm going to California.
For how long?
For good. I'm moving. I'm gonna get a fresh start. Thought it might be good for me.
When he told me that he was moving to California, I didn't believe him at first because it was such a far-fetched thing, because I don't even think he had a job at the time. But if he did go, it would actually kind of be a relief because, then he would just kind of move on.
Hey, that's great. I hear there's lots of palm trees and stuff there.
Oh yeah, and lots of pretty girls, right?
Yeah.
That's what I hear, So yeah, I guess I'm just saying you don't have to worry about me hanging around anymore.
Okay, well, hey, good luck out there.
Yeah. Good luck, man. That'll be really good for you.
One last hug before I go.
Okay, sure. All right.
I'll see you around, Karen.
See ya. Hey, what's wrong?
I think you need to find a ride.
You always hear of stranger danger and don't talk to strangers. You never think that it's going to be somebody who you know, somebody who you trust.
After a tumultuous year, Karen Wittes' possessive ex-boyfriend Leonard has moved clear across the country to California. For Karen, it's almost too good to be true.
Oh, God, sorry.
Tell your mom thanks for letting me borrow these.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Hey, honey.
Hey.
Was that Ron?
Yeah, he was returning these.
No.
We had a good mother-daughter relationship. I went out to work, supported the family, and Karen, she knew she could always come to me. Karen could always come to me with anything, and I would do my best to guide her.
So who's that from?
This is from Leonard.
Oh, God, another one?
Yeah, but I mean, it sounds like he's moving on, so.
A few months later, after he had moved to California, I received a letter from him. He went into great detail saying that he met a new girl in California. Her name, ironically, was Karen. He told me that he proposed to her on the beach in California.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah.
With Leonard seemingly out of the picture, Karen spends more quality time with new boyfriend Jeremy.
You know, I was thinking maybe we could go to the beach this summer.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah? I got this buddy who has a place in Jersey right on the water. It's beautiful. I was thinking we can maybe, spend a couple nights.
My ex-boyfriend was supposed to be in California, but I always kind of felt like he was kind of lurking around.
Hey. Hey. Karen.
Hi. Sorry.
What's the matter?
Nothing. I think I'm just seeing things or something. I don't know.
All right.
Tell me more about the beach, though.
It's got a volleyball court. I don't know if you play volleyball. Think you go swimming or something? There's a pool, and you're not even listening.
I'm sorry.
It was the craziest thing. It was like, is that really him? He had very dark brown hair, almost black. He looked like the same person, but then again, he didn't. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
But as days pass without any more sightings, Karen is soon able to relax into her summer routine until one day...
Okay, God, I'm coming.
Surprise.
He showed up at my door, and sure enough, his blonde hair was dyed completely black. If anything, he looked evil. My boyfriend at the time, he had black hair.
You like it?
This is something right out of a Stephen King book. He had actually transformed himself to try to look as much like he could of the new boyfriend.
What are you doing here? I thought you were in California.
Yeah, I'm here now. That's what matters, right?
He walked right past me and into the house. And there was just something about his whole look. He looked menacing.
Your boyfriend here.
No, I just got up.
How's your mother? She here?
No, she's at work.
I had to be in work by 7, and I worked in Center City which was, I guess, 45 minutes by public transportation. I worked all day.
But, Leonard, it's been forever. I'm sure she would love to see you. If you want to go stop by her work and say hi, maybe.
Yeah, maybe later.
Okay, well, you know the rules. No boys while my mom's not home.
It was bizarre. It freaked me out. I didn't understand what he was doing at all. So I tried to get him to leave. The big rule was that if my mom was in work, I was not allowed to have anybody in the house. And not only that, I was very, very leery because at this point, I knew that there was something not right.
Well, she doesn't know it won't hurt her, right?
Yeah, but she trusts you. Would you really want to violate that?
All right. I should go.
Yeah.
Can I just get a drink of cold water first? I walked all the way over here. It's kind of hot outside.
Yeah, definitely. Just how about you stay here, and I'll go get the water for you, okay? Okay.
My grandparents lived right down the street, so immediately I called my grandmother.
Yeah, hey, would you mind coming over here really quick? Leonard just kind of showed up out of nowhere and he's acting really weird and I'm just really nervous.
Fine! You want me to go, I'll go.
My grandmother was coming down. There was no way that he was going to stick around for that.
Within minutes, Karen's grandmother arrives to check on Karen.
No sign of him, honey?
My grandmother, she looked all around the house and she said that nobody was there and she felt safe.
Thanks. I know I'm just being a big baby about this.
No. You're being careful, and that's smart.
Thank you. You're the best. I appreciate it.
If I was in work and she needed somebody, either call my parents or go there. My parents lived right up the street, so we were close with my parents, too.
Now, why don't you come back up the street with me? I can make you some breakfast.
Oh, I'm really not that hungry. I think I'm just gonna go back to sleep. But I don't know, maybe I could come over later. We could watch TV or play cards or something.
You know, your grandfather says that I like to cheat, but that's just because he doesn't like to lose.
I know.
All right. Listen, honey, you be sure and lock this door after me, all right?
I know. Okay, yeah.
See you soon, sweetie.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
She felt safe and she locked up and went home. So I went back to bed. But he was still in the house.
After an unexpected visit from her possessive ex-boyfriend Leonard, Karen Wittes wants nothing more than to pretend it never happened. But it's not that easy.
I don't know how long I was asleep for, but I was woken up. I opened my eyes and it was my ex-boyfriend still in my house, in my bedroom, caressing my feet. Come on, Leonard! I jumped up and I screamed, you know, why are you still here? What are you doing? Why are you touching me? Get out of my room, get out of my room. I kept screaming.
What are you doing here?
Calm down, okay? I just thought it would be funny.
Yeah, I'm not laughing.
Yeah, I see that.
How did you get back in my house?
I never left.
Okay, I want you to leave right now.
But Karen,
Whatever you think is between us it's over, Leonard, okay?
That's how you're.
It is.
He calmly turned around and just walked out of my room.
Before I go, I just have a question.
And then literally, out of the blue, he stared at Karen and he said,
Can I strangle you?
It happened so quick. I thought at first there was no way that this could be real. He lifted me up over his head by my neck. My feet were completely off of the ground. I couldn't breathe at all. I couldn't feel anything. My body immediately went numb. I couldn't feel anything in my fingertips or in my toes. I was trying my hardest to fight back. I heard a ringing in my ear, and then I couldn't move anymore. And then finally, everything went black.
About half an hour later, Karen is still feeling foggy. But one thing is clear, Leonard is still there.
I love you, you know that. But you shouldn't have done what you did. You shouldn't have loved me!
I would regain consciousness, and as soon as I opened my eyes, he began punching me with a closed fist.
First, I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna find a bridge and jump off. That way we can be together again forever.
He asked me if I believed in God, because he wanted to be in heaven together with me forever. I was in complete shock. It was just, I didn't understand what was happening.
With Karen completely incapacitated, Leonard plots his next move.
Later, I regained consciousness, dressed in completely different clothes. He had put me in a dress that I had in my closet.
You look beautiful. Just the way I want to remember you.
Please, no, please. He looked at Karen as his. She was his possession, no one else's, in his mind. So he probably was going through those motions just to let her look good for her casket.
Leonard, please. Please.
I wish it didn't have to be like this.
You don't have to do this, please. Listen, if you love me, Leonard, you listen to me, okay?
It's too late. You had your chance.
You can just stop, okay? You can just stop, please. You don't have to do that.
That's not down!
He was kneeling next to me on the floor, and when I looked up, he raised a 14-inch serrated butcher knife. He jammed it right into my chest. He began twisting the knife, and then he pulled it out, and the blood went everywhere. And then he did it another time. And then this time, I thought that the blade of the knife went through my back and into the floor beneath me. It was almost like he was prying my ribs open. He was twisting the knife so bad.
But outside, it's the middle of the afternoon. With neighbors all off at work, there's no one around to help Karen. Her mother, Betty, is at work herself when she experiences a strange sensation.
I was getting ready to come home from work, and I felt a terrible stabbing pain in my left chest. It just took my breath away, and I had no idea what it could have been.
She was covered in blood from head to toe. It was a very gruesome scene. She'd lost an incredible amount of blood.
He kissed me one last time and told me that he loved me.
He put a sheet over her in an effort to conceal what happened.
He took me and he shoved me underneath of the bed and he left the room. I had this overwhelming feeling of death. I knew I was dying. I was thinking that I was never going to be able to see my friends again, that this was the last day that I was going to be alive.
"16-year-old Karen Wittes knows she needs help, and fast. She's been viciously stabbed by her deranged ex-boyfriend.
After he left the room, I tried to get out from underneath of the bed. I didn't know if he was still in the house or not. I knew I was dying, and if I waited there any longer, I wouldn't have made it. My stab wounds were actually making a pumping sound, and I thought it was because he stabbed me in my heart. But I was stronger than him, and I was going to win. So I kept repeating that to myself over and over again. I kind of moved the sheets, and with one hand over my stab wounds, I kind of like got myself out from underneath of the bed.
Leonard, unbeknownst to her, was still in her home at that time.
I staggered to call 911 on my bedroom phone. It felt like an eternity. It probably was only a few seconds, but it felt like it was forever. I was more or less dying on the floor, and I remember thinking, it's so important to let people know who did this. I don't want him to go unpunished. They need to know who did this.
911, what's your emergency? Help me, please.
The dispatcher answered, and I told her that I was being murdered. As soon as I said that, he ran back into the bedroom. He ripped the phone from my hand and hung the phone up on me.
You shouldn't have done that.
I would put pressure on my stab wounds, and I remember he actually ripping my hand off of my chest and telling me, no, let yourself go, Karen, let yourself die.
For Karen.
This was it. I was never going to see my mom again. I just wanted my mom to come home from work so bad to rescue me.
Goodbye, Karen.
I didn't want to die on that floor. And I certainly didn't want to die by the hands of him. I managed to get myself up standing, and I actually walked down the steps across my living room to the front door. I stood out on my front step with my right hand over my stab wounds, and I remember just having this tunnel vision that I need to get to my grandparents' house. And I just kept pushing forward.
Oh my God.
Somehow I managed to stagger 8 houses up the street to my grandparents' house, up their front steps, and into their house.
As much blood as Karen is losing,
Call 911.
her grandparents know they can't wait for paramedics to arrive. Something must be done now.
My grandfather was a World War II vet. So he immediately went into his army training, and he put the pressure on my stab wounds.
As Karen clings to life on the kitchen floor, news of her gruesome attack quickly spreads to Philadelphia police officer Bobby Walls.
We got a 911 call of a stabbing. She'd been stabbed repeatedly, multiple times. in the chest.
Okay. Go get some more towels. Go get some more towels. Hey, you hang in there, okay?
She wasn't conscious at first, and we wanted to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. This young girl was critical. I had 4 years on the job, and I'd never seen anything that hit me so hard.
We're gonna get you to the hospital.
I was trying my best I could to give a complete description of who did this to me.
Okay, Leonard. What's Leonard's last name?
I was completely determined to tell. That was my whole goal. That was the thing that I kept striving for. My mind was set on, there's no way he's going to get away with this. And even if I were to die from this, I want everybody to know who did this to me.
We're gonna find him, okay? I promise. We'll do everything we can to find him.
I didn't think she was going to make it.
Miss, keep your eyes open, okay?
Just by my 4 years experience of watching so many people in better shape than her pass.
Karen, baby.
As paramedics take Karen away, Officer Walls turns his attention to her attacker.
When you see a tiny girl like Karen and she's been brutalized, every emotion of vengeance, every emotion of retribution that you've ever thought of runs through your head.
Dispatch, this is Walls. We need APB on a Leonard Tilton. Repeat, Leonard Tilton.
I was surrounded by an entire district of guys who were just like me. When something happened like this, these guys they'd scour every inch of the district. You weren't safe anywhere. And we began a hell of a manhunt for this guy.
Meanwhile, Karen's mom, Betty, is headed home from a long day of work without any idea of her daughter's harrowing ordeal.
I was only a few streets from my house, and an ambulance or rescue squad came around the corner in front of the bus, and I never seen a rescue squad going as fast as that one was. And I remember saying to myself, oh my goodness, I hope whoever's in there is going to be all right and they make it.
But as Betty arrives home, she quickly realizes that it's her own daughter that was being transported.
All my neighbors were out, and I said, what in the world's going on? And somebody came over to me and said, a family friend was there, going to take me to the hospital.
At the hospital, Betty is given a report even more devastating than she anticipated.
I wish I had better news for you.
I couldn't believe it. Your mind just does all kinds of things, you know. You just can't accept things. I felt my knees giving out.
I'm sorry. I don't know how else to say this.
I didn't realize they were taking us in to say goodbye, that she wouldn't make it. It scared me so bad. It still does. And I started praying, and I never prayed so hard in my life.
As Karen's family braces themselves for the worst, Philadelphia police are out trying to find Leonard Tilton, her attacker.
I did everything I could, not only to get his description on the police radio and, you know, his where he might be going, but I then start canvassing the area. I have a sister. If anyone ever did that to her, I would want that police officer to spend the rest of his time tracking down that guy too. If you don't do your absolute best, you're in the wrong line of work. After canvassing the area, I wasn't having much luck, and I started to think that maybe he'd fled the neighborhood and wasn't in the area. But for the life of me, something kept, you know, nagging at me that he couldn't have gotten too far.
And sure enough, Officer Walls soon receives the lead he's been hoping for.
Attention all units. Suspect Leonard Tilton sighted on the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge.
Copy that. This is Walls. I'm en route.
Hearing that call was just the greatest feeling that we were, maybe we have a shot at catching this guy.
Officer Bobby Walls is on the hunt for Karen Wittes' violent ex-boyfriend Leonard Tilton, who was reportedly last seen near Philadelphia's Tacony-Palmyra Bridge.
As I was approaching the bridge, I saw a male walking on the pedestrian walkway east, and he fit the description of the suspect. I immediately grabbed my police radio, said I have the suspect in sight.
Leonard Tilton! Step away from the ledge and put your hands in the air.
That's your dad?
Back away, Leonard. Get on the ground and put your hands behind your back.
I killed her, didn't I? You might as well just shoot me.
No. Doesn't have to end like that, all right? Just step away. Come on. It's over.
Then he did something neither one of us was expecting. He was preparing to jump. And I just reacted. I jumped onto the railing and I tackled him on it.
Where do you think you're going? You're under arrest.
He kept asking, is she dead? Is she dead? And I said, no, she's alive, but you're going to jail. He actually was upset that she wasn't dead. All he wanted was that end result. He wanted her to die. And he was clutching a picture of Karen in his hand, covered in blood. I was shocked that this guy was so psychotically obsessed with this girl.
Despite everything she's been through, Karen's will to live remains as strong as ever. After a week in the hospital, she's on the road to recovery.
Nobody thought that I was going to survive this. The stab wounds were incredibly close to my heart. It was 1/8 of an inch all the way around. It was almost like a C, and it was all the way around my heart, and it was just like my heart was untouched.
I thank God every day for sparing her life. I think her life is getting better and better because she's getting stronger and stronger.
Just when Karen thinks the worst is behind her, she learns some devastating news.
Honey, there's something we need to talk about. Okay.
At the hospital, I asked them if she had been raped. I thought she knew what had happened. I didn't realize that Karen was unconscious when this monster raped her.
Everybody knew but me. I was literally the last person to know that I was raped. I went from thinking that this was kind of like an ex-boyfriend obsession to now a whole different crime. He's a rapist too. And it just took on a whole different light. And it was excruciating.
Leonard waives his right to a trial and agrees to plead guilty to aggravated assault and rape.
He was sentenced to an aggregate sentence of 15 to 40 years incarceration.
The maximum date that they can hold him in prison is July 5th, 2034. I don't think that there's anything that could have possibly cured him while incarcerated, since he's contacted me numerous times. He wrote me love letters. He actually dedicated love songs to me, and he wrote me a poem. I'm scared for my life. And I'm scared for, who knows, maybe the next Karen Wittes.
To make matters worse, Karen's contact with Leonard isn't just by mail.
In 2009, he was up for his first parole hearing. What I didn't realize at the time, even though the parole board ordered him to serve his maximum sentence, under current law, inmates are able to actually apply for parole on their own, regardless of what the parole board says, every single year. And it just does nothing besides re-victimize me over and over again.
Karen is fighting to stop the endless cycle of having to give a victim statement every year before a parole board with a bill she's proposing to the state Senate.
What Karen's Law does, it reduces the re-victimization that survivors face on a yearly basis by extending the parole application waiting period for sexually violent offenders.
What most people don't know is that after completing their minimum sentence, inmates can actually request a parole hearing every single year, regardless of what the parole board orders. While I am certainly thankful that he is behind bars, let me tell you, it does not end there.
We actually generated a lot of support for the bill, and we've had very, very good response so far. Throughout my 20s and 30s, I just really tried to focus on living the life that I fought so desperately hard to keep. I didn't want this attack to define who I was. But then I came to realize that this attack doesn't define who I am. What I did to fight and survive is what defines who I am. And my advocacy work, that's what defines who I am. And that's my passion and that's my drive. And that's what I'm trying to do with Karen's Law. Being true to myself ultimately did win out in the end.
5 years later, DNA revealed the second killer, the Serica Dunkley Holness murder. Part 1. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, on a dark stretch of rural Maryland highway, a woman was dying in a field. There were no crowds. No flashing cameras. No witnesses standing nearby. Only the empty road, the darkness of Kent County, and the sound of a man claiming that a stranger had attacked him and murdered his wife. The story sounded terrifying. A masked carjacker. A gun. A knife. A forced drive across state lines. A woman trying to escape into the darkness. A husband supposedly bound and left helpless on the side of the road. And then, according to the story, the killer disappeared. But investigators would soon discover something that changed everything. The stranger did not exist. The carjacking had never happened. And the man standing in the middle of the nightmare was not simply a survivor. He was part of the plan. The woman in the field was 26-year-old Serica Dunkley Holness. Her body had been discovered near Route 290 in the Crumpton area of Kent County, Maryland, during the early morning hours of June 5, 2009. Court records later established that she had suffered 11 stab wounds, along with numerous defensive cuts to her hands. But before investigators understood what had happened, they had to listen to a story that sounded almost impossible. A story designed to send them searching for an invisible killer. Serica had been traveling with her husband, Ryan Holness. The two had left Brooklyn, New York, and were supposedly heading toward Maryland. Ryan would later tell police that they had stopped for gas along the New Jersey Turnpike. That was where, he claimed, everything changed. According to his account, a masked stranger carrying a gun and a knife approached them and forced his way into their vehicle. The stranger allegedly ordered them to drive. Not a few miles. All the way toward Maryland. Eventually, Ryan said, the attacker directed them to a remote area. And that was where the nightmare supposedly reached its final act. Ryan claimed that the attacker dragged him from the vehicle, restrained him with duct tape, and attacked Serica when she tried to escape. He said he was helpless. He said he heard the attack. He said he was knocked unconscious. And eventually, he claimed, he managed to free himself and reach a nearby home to call for help. The story had all the ingredients of a terrifying random crime. A faceless predator. A deserted road. A young woman murdered far from home. A husband who had supposedly survived by chance. But investigators were not convinced. Something about the story did not fit. The details were inconsistent. The physical evidence did not cooperate. And the more investigators looked, the more the supposed carjacking began to collapse. Within less than 24 hours, Ryan Holness had gone from grieving husband to murder suspect. The transformation was sudden, but the evidence would continue to accumulate. Investigators learned that Serica's husband had a financial motive that could not be ignored. Months before the killing, Ryan had obtained a $500,000 life insurance policy on Serica and named himself as the sole beneficiary. That discovery did not prove murder, but it changed the question. Investigators were no longer simply asking, who attacked this couple? They were asking something much darker. What if there had never been an attacker? What if the man who reported the crime had helped create it? And if Ryan Holness had planned the killing, had he done it alone? That question would remain unanswered for years. Because somewhere inside the evidence collected from that dark Maryland road was another person's blood. Another man's DNA. At first, investigators knew only one thing about him. He was unknown. His identity was hidden inside a laboratory result. His blood had been left behind at the crime scene. It would eventually be recovered from the Honda, from Serica's purse, from one of her sandals, and from a paperback book. The killer's accomplice had unknowingly left a biological signature behind. But nobody knew his name. Not yet. For 4 years that DNA profile waited. And while it waited, the case of Serica Dunkley Holness continued through the courts. Ryan Holness was eventually convicted. The man who had claimed to be a victim was found guilty of murdering his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison. But the investigation had not reached its final answer. Because one mystery remained. Who was the second man? Who had traveled with Ryan and Serica? Who had helped construct the false carjacking? Who had helped create the illusion that an unknown stranger had entered their lives and vanished into the darkness? For years, the answer remained locked inside a national DNA database. Then, in 2013, thousands of miles away in California, police collected a routine DNA sample from a man arrested on an unrelated charge. The sample was processed. The profile entered the system. And somewhere inside that massive network of genetic records, an old Maryland crime scene suddenly came alive again. The database produced a match. The unknown male finally had a name. Delando Ricardo Campbell. And the discovery would reveal that the murder of Serica Dunkley Holness had been even more carefully planned than investigators initially understood. Part 2. The name Serica Dunkley Holness did not belong to a mystery at first. She was a young woman living in Brooklyn, New York. She had family. She had a husband. She had a life that from the outside could appear ordinary. But behind that ordinary appearance was a marriage that would become central to one of Maryland's most disturbing murder investigations. Serica had married Ryan Holness in 2003. Ryan lived in Maryland near his military duty station, while Serica lived in Brooklyn with members of his family. Court records later described the relationship as complicated, and investigators uncovered evidence that Ryan maintained relationships with other women. Then came the insurance policy. November 5, 2008. Ryan used Serica's personal information to obtain a $500,000 life insurance policy. He made himself the sole beneficiary. That fact would become one of the most important pieces of the prosecution's case. But at the time, Serica could not have known what was coming. She could not have known that someone close to her was preparing a plan. She could not have known that the final journey she took from Brooklyn toward Maryland would end beside a rural road. And she could not have known that another man had already been brought into the plan. That man was Delando Ricardo Campbell. Campbell and Ryan Holness knew each other from their time serving together in the United States Navy. They had known each other since approximately 2002. Years later, prosecutors would establish that their relationship had become part of something far darker. Between May and June 4, 2009, Ryan contacted Campbell by telephone and text message at least 34 times. The frequency mattered. Because these were not random communications between old friends. According to Campbell's later plea agreement, the conversations were connected to a plan to murder Serica. Ryan arranged for Campbell to travel to New York City. The purpose was not friendship. It was murder. The plan was designed to make Serica's death look like the result of a carjacking. The illusion needed several pieces. There had to be a believable location. There had to be a believable victim. There had to be a believable survivor. And there had to be a believable stranger. But the stranger would never exist. On June 4, 2009, Serica and Ryan began their journey south. Campbell was involved. The three would eventually travel together toward Maryland. The trip itself became one of the most important parts of the prosecution's reconstruction. Because investigators later learned that the journey was not simply a drive between New York and Maryland. It was the movement of three people toward a carefully selected killing ground. The destination was a rural area near Route 290 in Kent County. A place where darkness could hide almost everything. A place where a body could be left beside a road. A place where a fabricated story about a carjacking might initially seem plausible. But plans made by human beings have weaknesses. They leave traces. And sometimes those traces are microscopic. A fingerprint. A phone record. A search history. A drop of blood. A piece of duct tape. A discarded object. A shoe. Purse. A book. A biological profile waiting inside a laboratory freezer. That night, the people involved in the murder did not know how much evidence they were creating. They thought about the immediate problem. They thought about the story. They thought about escape. They thought about making the crime look random. But they could not think about everything. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on June 5, the Honda reached the area along Maryland Route 290. Ryan parked on a farm access road. Serica was taken into the field. There she was attacked. Repeatedly. The wounds were severe. The evidence later showed that she fought back. Cuts on her hands indicated defensive injuries. She had tried to protect herself. She had tried to survive. But the attack continued. And eventually Serica Dunkley Holness was dead. Her body was left behind. The people responsible moved on. And the story began. Within hours, Ryan would present himself as the surviving victim. The supposed carjacking would become the explanation. But while Ryan was talking, the physical evidence was already telling a different story. The Honda would become critical. So would the road. So would the field. So would the objects scattered around the scene. And eventually so would a few tiny drops of blood. Blood that belonged to a man investigators did not yet know. The investigation had begun with a murder. It was now becoming something else. A reconstruction. A search for contradictions. A battle between a story and the evidence. And evidence has one dangerous quality for anyone trying to hide a crime. It does not get tired. It does not forget. It does not become emotional. Years can pass. People can move across the country. Names can disappear from police reports. Memories can fade. But DNA remains. And in the case of Serica Dunkley Holness, one man's blood was about to wait patiently for the truth to catch up with him. Part 3. The first version of the crime came from Ryan Holness. He was the surviving husband. He was the man who claimed he had been attacked. He was the man who told investigators that a stranger had taken control of the vehicle. According to Ryan's account, the attack began at a New Jersey Turnpike rest stop. A masked man. A weapon. A sudden assault. A forced drive. Then Maryland. Then the field. Then Serica's death. Then Ryan's supposed escape. But the story contained a problem. Investigators were standing at the scene, And the scene did not behave like the story. The physical evidence was wrong. The vehicle was wrong. The movements of the people involved were wrong. And soon investigators began finding details that suggested the supposed carjacking was staged. Ryan had claimed he had been bound. He had injuries. But the overall evidence suggested that he had inflicted injuries on himself as part of the deception. A later federal court filing summarized the prosecution's theory. Ryan had attempted to make the murder look like a carjacking, using duct tape and a staged injury to support the story. The question became simple. If Ryan had staged the scene, who helped him? Because the Honda was not the only problem. Investigators recovered items around the area. Purse. A paperback book. A woman's sandal. A tennis shoe. Identification. Duct tape. And other objects that seemed to have been deliberately placed where police would find them. The scene looked chaotic. But sometimes chaos can be manufactured. And manufactured chaos has patterns. One of the most important discoveries came from the vehicle. Blood was found inside the Honda. Some of it belonged to Ryan. Some belonged to Serica. But another profile appeared. An unknown male. Unknown male one. That profile would become the ghost inside the case. Investigators knew that an unidentified man had left biological evidence. They did not know who he was. They did not know why he was there. They did not know whether he was a killer, an accomplice, or an innocent person whose blood had somehow entered the vehicle. But the profile did not exist in isolation. The same mystery man's blood was found on Serica's sandal, her purse, and the paperback book. 3 separate objects. 3 separate pieces of evidence. One unknown male. That was not easy to explain away. And the investigators were now facing an extraordinary question. If the carjacker was real, why had he left his blood behind? If the carjacker was a stranger, how had his blood appeared on objects connected directly to Serica? And if there had never been a carjacker, then who was this unknown man? The answer would eventually be Delando Campbell. But in those early days, nobody had that name. The investigation continued. Ryan's story continued to collapse. Police learned that the Honda had eventually been recovered in Washington, D.C. That discovery mattered because investigators found evidence suggesting the vehicle had been deliberately moved away from the murder scene. A later court record stated that Campbell drove Ryan's car to Washington, D.C., where it was abandoned so police would later discover it. The distance between Maryland and Washington was not merely geographic. It was part of the deception. The murder scene was in rural Kent County. The car was left in Washington. The goal was to make investigators think about a fleeing stranger, a criminal passing through, a random carjacker who had vanished. But every staged crime carries a risk. The more details someone invents, the more opportunities there are for those details to collide with reality. And they were beginning to collide. Investigators also examined electronic evidence. A computer associated with Ryan's apartment contained searches made less than a week before the murder involving Apex and Greyhound websites. One of the relevant Apex bus locations was near H Street in Washington, D.C., close to where the Honda was later recovered. The picture was changing. The supposed random attack was beginning to look planned. The supposed helpless husband was beginning to look like an architect. And the unknown male was becoming increasingly important. Then there was the knife. A K-9 tracked Ryan sent away from the murder scene toward a nearby river. Investigators found the knife there. The weapon had not disappeared into the darkness. It had been discarded. And now the physical evidence was connecting the pieces. The insurance policy. The trip. The staged carjacking. The vehicle. The knife. The duct tape. The electronic searches. The unknown male DNA. And Ryan's changing story. The case was no longer about finding a masked stranger. It was about proving that the stranger never existed. But even after Ryan Holness was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment, one major question remained unanswered. Who was unknown male one? For the investigators, that question was not a loose end. It was a locked door. Behind it was another person. Another participant. Another secret. And the key to that door was sitting inside a DNA database. Waiting. Part 4. In a murder investigation, time can feel like the enemy. Witnesses forget. Documents disappear into archives. People relocate. Relationships change. Technology becomes obsolete. But DNA does not care how long you wait. The blood found in the Serica Dunkley Holness investigation was entered into a national database. The profile belonged to an unknown man. Investigators had a biological identity without a human identity. It was like having a fingerprint without a name. For 4 years there was no match. The profile waited. The case moved forward. Ryan Holness faced trial. The prosecution presented evidence that challenged virtually every part of his story. The jury heard about the insurance policy. They heard about the journey from New York. They heard about the supposed carjacking. They heard about the physical evidence. They heard about the knife. They heard about the vehicle. They heard about the DNA. And eventually Ryan Holness was convicted. He received a life sentence. But the unknown man remained unknown. The case had one conviction. But the investigation still contained a shadow. Then came 2013. In California, Delando Ricardo Campbell was arrested on an unrelated matter. As part of that process, California authorities collected his DNA. It was routine. Nothing about the collection necessarily suggested that it would reopen a Maryland murder. But the sample entered the system. And the database did what databases are designed to do. It compared. One profile against another. One biological signature against another. And then there was a match. The unknown male from the 2009 Maryland murder scene had finally been identified. Delando Ricardo Campbell. 4 years after Serica's murder, the name emerged. The discovery was devastatingly simple. The blood had been waiting. Campbell's DNA matched the unknown male profile from the Maryland crime scene. The same DNA evidence connected him to objects associated with Serica. His blood had been recovered from the victim's purse. From her sandal. From the paperback book. And from the vehicle. The mysterious stranger had a name. But the name created a new question. Why was Delando Campbell there? He was not a random stranger. He knew Ryan Holness. The two had served together in the Navy. And according to Campbell's eventual plea agreement, Ryan had contacted him repeatedly in the weeks leading up to the murder. At least 34 calls and text messages were documented between May and June 4, 2009. The communications were not casual. They were part of the planning. Campbell eventually admitted that Ryan had arranged for him to travel to New York City to help with the murder. The supposed carjacking was not an improvisation. It was the cover story. Ryan wanted Serica dead. And he wanted police to believe that an unknown criminal had killed her. Campbell agreed to help. The discovery transformed the case. The unidentified blood was no longer mysterious. It was evidence of an accomplice. A second man. A second participant. A second person who had entered the plan. The story of Serica's final night now had another layer. She had not been attacked by a stranger who appeared from nowhere. She had been brought into a situation that had been planned in advance. The people around her knew what was coming. She did not. That imbalance is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Serica entered the journey believing she was traveling with people she knew. But investigators later established that one of those people was helping plan her death. And another man had traveled to participate. The horror was not random. It was deliberate. The crime scene had been constructed. The story had been rehearsed. The evidence had been manipulated. And yet the plan had failed. Because blood had been left behind. That tiny biological trace survived the deception. It survived the abandoned vehicle. It survived the false story. It survived the arrest and conviction of Ryan Holness. It survived 4 years of silence. Then it found Delando Campbell. In July 2014, Campbell pleaded guilty in federal court to interstate domestic violence resulting in the death of a spouse. His plea agreement described his role in the murder and the plan to disguise it as a carjacking. The mystery had become a confession. But the most haunting part was that the case did not need a dramatic confession to expose Campbell. The evidence had already been there. A drop of blood. A DNA profile. A database. For years. That was enough. The man who believed he could disappear had left something behind that could not disappear with him. Part 5. The plan was supposed to be convincing. That was the point. A murder could not simply look like a murder. It needed a different explanation. A stranger. A robbery. A carjacking. A random act of violence. Something investigators could chase away from the people who actually knew Serica. The story Ryan Holness gave police was constructed around that idea. He described a masked attacker. He claimed the man carried weapons. He claimed the attacker forced the couple toward Maryland. He claimed the man separated him from Serica. He claimed Serica tried to escape. He claimed the attacker killed her. And he claimed he was left helpless. But the crime scene told a different story. The evidence suggested that Ryan had participated directly. He had inflicted an injury on himself. He had used duct tape to support the appearance that he had been restrained. And he had helped create a scene intended to point toward an imaginary attacker. Then there was Campbell. Campbell's later plea agreement provided the missing piece. He admitted that he had deliberately left his own blood at the scene. Not accidentally. Deliberately. The purpose was to strengthen the carjacking story. Drops of blood were placed inside the passenger compartment of the Honda and on personal items associated with Serica. The deception was sophisticated enough to create an illusion, but not sophisticated enough to survive forensic science. Because Campbell had done something that would ultimately destroy the illusion. He had introduced his own DNA into the crime scene. The blood that was meant to support the lie became the evidence that identified the liar. That is the paradox at the center of the case. The same evidence intended to mislead investigators eventually led directly to the accomplice. Campbell thought the blood would help. Instead, it became his signature. And the objects carrying that signature were deeply connected to Serica. Her purse. Her sandal. A paperback book. Objects that had no reason to carry the blood of a random stranger. Unless that stranger was not random. Unless he had been there. Unless he had been part of the plan. The DNA did not tell investigators everything. DNA does not narrate a crime. It does not explain motive. It does not tell a jury what someone was thinking. But it can answer one brutally simple question. Was this biological material connected to this person? In Campbell's case, the answer became yes. And that scientific connection opened the door to the rest of the investigation. The communications with Ryan. The trip to New York. The journey to Maryland. The staged crime scene. The abandoned vehicle. The false carjacking. The blood. The evidence was no longer a collection of strange details. It was a sequence. And sequences reveal intent. The prosecution's case showed that Ryan had obtained the life insurance policy months before Serica's murder. He had made himself the sole beneficiary. Then, in the weeks before the killing, he communicated repeatedly with Campbell. The plan developed. The journey happened. Serica was killed. The vehicle was moved. The story was told. And the accomplice's blood was left behind. That sequence destroyed the idea of coincidence. It showed planning. It showed preparation. It showed an attempt to control what investigators would believe. But investigators had something the killers could not control: the physical world. Blood behaves according to biology. A knife leaves evidence. A vehicle records movement. A computer records searches. A telephone records communication. A human body carries injuries. And a false story must somehow survive all of them. Ryan's story did not. His account collapsed under the weight of evidence. And once Campbell was identified, the final architecture of the murder became visible. The supposed stranger had been invited into the plan. The supposed carjacking had been manufactured. The supposed victim survivor was actually one of the perpetrators. The supposed random murder had been targeted. And the woman who had been killed had unknowingly been surrounded by people who knew what was coming. The case was no longer an unsolved mystery. But it remained a haunting example of how close a carefully planned crime can come to disappearing. For 4 years, Campbell was just a blank space in the investigation. Unknown male 1. No photograph. No name. No obvious connection. Then one routine DNA collection in California changed everything. That is the part that still feels almost cinematic. Not because of a dramatic chase. Not because someone confessed in a dark interrogation room. But because the truth arrived quietly. A laboratory result. A database match. A name. 4 years after the murder. The past had reached across state lines and found the man who had tried to leave it behind. Part 6. When the name Delando Campbell surfaced, investigators were no longer looking at a stranger. They were looking at someone with a history connected directly to Ryan Holness. The two men had served together in the Navy. They knew each other. That relationship was critical. Because the defense of the fictional carjacker depended on randomness. The killer was supposed to be unknown, unconnected, unpredictable. But Campbell was not random. He was connected to the husband. And according to prosecutors, that connection had been activated specifically for the murder. The communications were extensive. At least 34 phone calls and text messages occurred between Ryan and Campbell between May and June 4, 2009. The timing mattered. The murder happened June 5. The contacts increased as the date approached. The plan was moving toward execution. Campbell traveled to New York City. He joined Ryan in Serica. The three eventually traveled toward Maryland. And sometime during that journey, Serica's fate was sealed. What makes the case particularly disturbing is the simplicity of the supposed cover story. Carjacking. It was a familiar crime. A random attacker. A desperate husband. A woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a narrative designed to trigger fear. And fear can make a story feel believable. But investigators did not have to believe the story. They had to test it. They examined the injuries. They examined the vehicle. They examined the road. They examined the objects. They examined the communications. They examined the digital evidence. And they examined the DNA. The story could not survive all of those tests. One of the most revealing details was the movement of the vehicle. After the murder, the Honda was driven to Washington, D.C. The car was abandoned. The purpose, according to later court records, was to make it appear as though the vehicle had been taken by a fleeing attacker. But why Washington? Because Washington was not simply somewhere to abandon a car. It was part of the plan. Investigators later found computer searches related to transportation websites, including Apex and Greyhound, shortly before the murder. The evidence suggested planning for movement after the killing. The abandoned Honda was not an accident. It was another piece of theater. But every staged scene has a weakness. The people staging it know what they want investigators to see. They do not always understand what investigators will notice. The Honda became evidence. The duct tape became evidence. The knife became evidence. The blood became evidence. The phone calls became evidence. The insurance policy became evidence. And eventually, Campbell himself became evidence. The case demonstrates something investigators learn again and again. A crime scene is not only where a crime happened. It is also where a criminal's decisions are recorded. Every decision creates a consequence. If someone moves a vehicle, investigators can ask why. If someone searches for a bus route, investigators can ask why. If someone buys insurance on a person and names themselves as beneficiary, investigators can ask why. If someone leaves blood on a victim's belongings, investigators can ask why. The answers may come separately. But when the answers point in the same direction, a pattern emerges. The pattern in Serica's case was devastating. Ryan wanted Serica dead. He had a financial incentive. He recruited Campbell. Campbell traveled to New York. They traveled together. Serica was killed. The scene was staged. The vehicle was moved. The story was fabricated. And Campbell's blood was left behind. The crime had been designed to look like something it was not. But the evidence exposed what it really was. A planned killing disguised as a random attack. And yet, even after the conviction of Ryan Holness, the full story did not become public immediately. The identity of the second participant remained hidden. For the public, the case had one central figure: Ryan. But investigators knew there was another. Someone who had helped. Someone whose blood was present. Someone who had walked away. That person had spent years outside the spotlight. Until California. Until the DNA sample. Until the match. Until the name. Delando Campbell. The case that had once seemed to contain an invisible attacker now had two identified perpetrators. Ryan Holness was already serving a life sentence. Campbell was arrested and brought to Maryland. The unknown male had finally stepped out of the shadows. But the DNA did something more than identify him. It proved the power of evidence that can survive deception. The men had tried to create a story. DNA created a different one. The story was not written in words. It was written in biology. And biology had no reason to lie. Part 7. By 2014, nearly 5 years had passed since Serica Dunkley Holness was murdered. The case was no longer a fresh crime. The body had been buried. The courtroom battles had already transformed the first suspect into a convicted murderer. The community had moved forward. But the investigation had not completely stopped. Somewhere in the system was a profile belonging to an unknown man. That profile was the unfinished sentence. Then Campbell's California arrest reopened the chapter. The DNA match was the breakthrough. Federal prosecutors announced that the blood Campbell left behind at the 2009 crime scene had been analyzed and entered into a national DNA database, where it remained for 4 years before a match was found. There is something almost unsettling about that timeline. 4 years. The evidence did not disappear. It waited. The killer's identity was not lost forever. It was simply not known yet. That distinction matters. Because cold cases often feel frozen. But evidence can remain active long after the people involved stop talking. Campbell eventually pleaded guilty. In his plea, he admitted helping Ryan Holness murder Serica. He admitted the plan to disguise the crime as a carjacking. He admitted his involvement in creating the staged scene. And he admitted leaving his blood behind as part of the deception. The man who had once existed only as unknown male one now stood before a federal judge. The mystery had become a prosecution. The prosecution had become a conviction. And in November 2014, Campbell was sentenced to 30 years in prison followed by 5 years of supervised release. The case that had begun with a fabricated carjacking ended with 2 men held responsible. Ryan Holness, Delando Campbell. 2 participants. 1 victim. And 1 elaborate deception. But the most important person in the case was not either man. It was Serica. The investigation documents often reduce a victim to evidence. A body. An injury pattern. A DNA profile. A timeline. A photograph. But behind every forensic fact is a person. Serica was 26 years old. She was traveling from New York. She was with someone she trusted. She did not know that the journey was part of a plan. She did not know that the man beside her had already decided what would happen. She did not know that another man had been brought into the plan. She did not know that her death had been assigned a false explanation before it even happened. That is what makes the crime so disturbing. The murder was not simply violent. It was deceptive. The people responsible did not only attempt to kill her. They attempted to rewrite the circumstances of her death. They wanted the world to believe that an unknown stranger had done it. They wanted the investigation to begin in the wrong direction. They wanted the victim's final moments to be misunderstood. But the evidence refused. The field spoke. The vehicle spoke. The knife spoke. The computer spoke. The telephone records spoke. And eventually the DNA spoke. The false story could not silence all of them. There is also a lesson in the way Campbell was identified. He was not discovered because investigators somehow recognized his face. He was not discovered because a witness suddenly remembered his name. He was not discovered because he voluntarily walked into a police station. He was identified because his DNA entered a system that could compare the unknown with the known. A routine collection in California became the key to a Maryland murder. A local arrest became a national breakthrough. A biological sample became a bridge between 2 states in 2 years. That is why the case remains such a powerful example of forensic investigation. The murder happened in 2009. The DNA match came in 2013. Campbell pleaded guilty in 2014. The sentence followed that same year. The mystery did not last 30 years. It lasted approximately 4 years before the unknown accomplice was identified. But 4 years is still a long time for a family to live with questions. 4 years is a long time for evidence to sit in a database. 4 years is a long time for an unknown name to remain attached to a murder. And 4 years is long enough for investigators to wonder whether the second person would ever be found. He was. Not through luck alone. Through evidence. Through persistence. Through forensic science. And through the smallest trace imaginable. Blood. Part 8. The most haunting evidence in the case was not necessarily the most dramatic. It was not the knife. It was not the duct tape. It was not the abandoned Honda. It was the blood. Blood has a way of exposing proximity. Someone can deny being present. Someone can invent a story. Someone can claim they were somewhere else. But if their biological material is found in the wrong place at the wrong time, investigators have a new question. Why? Campbell's blood was found in places connected to Serica. The evidence included the Honda, Serica's purse, her sandal, and a paperback book. The DNA profile was not simply a theoretical possibility. It became a direct link between Campbell and the murder scene. And the circumstances made that connection devastating. Campbell was not an unknown passerby. He knew Ryan. He had traveled to New York. He had participated in the plan. He had been present during the journey. And he eventually admitted his role. The blood had been intended to create the illusion of a wounded carjacker. Instead, it created an identification trail. This is the strange irony of forensic evidence. A criminal may believe that evidence is dangerous only if investigators find it. But sometimes the most dangerous evidence is the evidence the criminal deliberately creates. Campbell deliberately left blood. He wanted investigators to see it. He wanted them to believe that a stranger had been injured. He wanted the blood to strengthen the lie. Years later, that same blood became the key to his identity. The deception had turned against its creator. And that reversal is at the center of the entire case. The killers tried to control the narrative. The evidence took control instead. Ryan's story had depended on investigators believing in a stranger. But there was no stranger. There was Campbell. There was Ryan. There was Serica. And there was a plan. The prosecution did not need to invent a dramatic theory. The facts were already dramatic enough. A husband had taken out a $500,000 insurance policy on his wife. He had made himself the beneficiary. He had communicated repeatedly with an old military associate. The associate traveled to New York. The three traveled toward Maryland. Serica was killed. The crime scene was staged. The vehicle was moved. The husband claimed to be a victim. And the accomplice's blood was left behind. Every individual fact might be explained in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to escape. Ryan Holness was convicted after a 2-week trial. The evidence against him included DNA and other forensic evidence, as well as the reconstruction of the staged carjacking. One of the more extraordinary details came from a confession letter Ryan wrote while incarcerated. The letter was presented as though it came from the real killer. It contained details about the murder that had not been publicly revealed. Ryan asked another person to send the letter to the Washington Post. But investigators and prosecutors treated it as evidence connecting him to information only the killer should have known. The attempt to create another mystery only created another connection. A false killer. A false confession. A false carjacking. Layer after layer of deception. And underneath all of it was the same reality. Serica had been murdered. The men responsible had attempted to construct an alternate explanation. But reality kept breaking through. The field. The blood. The knife. The vehicle. The computer. The phone records. The insurance policy. The confession letter. And eventually the DNA match. The case became a lesson in how a fabricated crime scene can collapse under cumulative evidence. Not one clue. Many. Not one contradiction. A pattern. Not one investigator's suspicion. A chain of independent facts. And perhaps the most chilling part is that the first investigators did not need to know everything immediately. They only needed to preserve the evidence. Because they could not identify Campbell in 2009. But the evidence was preserved. And when technology and databases caught up, the past opened again. That is the real power of a DNA cold case match. It does not require the evidence to remember. It only requires the evidence to survive. Part 9. For Serica's family, the investigation was never simply a case number. The legal documents could describe her as the victim. The forensic reports could describe wounds. The court could describe evidence. But to the people who knew her, she was more than a name in a murder prosecution. She was a daughter. A relative. A woman whose life ended in a place where she had never expected to die. And for the first days after her death, even the truth of what happened remained uncertain. There was a story. A terrifying story. A husband saying that a stranger had attacked them. A field. A body. A missing vehicle. A supposed masked killer. But investigators refused to accept the story simply because it was frightening. They tested it. That decision changed everything. The supposed attack at the New Jersey Turnpike became a point of investigation. The alleged restraints became evidence. The vehicle became evidence. The injuries became evidence. The objects became evidence. And eventually the DNA became evidence. The investigation demonstrated the difference between a story and a fact. A story can be rehearsed. A fact must survive examination. Ryan's story did not. The prosecution established that he had created a false account to disguise his involvement. The Fourth Circuit later described the evidence as overwhelming and upheld his conviction. But the second man remained a separate mystery. The DNA profile had no name. The profile could say who the blood belonged to only after a comparison became available. Then California provided that comparison. Campbell's unrelated arrest created the match. And suddenly the investigation acquired a second defendant. The timing is important. The DNA match did not occur because investigators had stopped looking. It occurred because forensic evidence was retained and later compared against a new sample. That is how the case moved from suspicion to identification. Campbell was no longer unknown male one. He was Delando Ricardo Campbell. And once his name was known, the relationship with Ryan became critical. The men had served together in the Navy. The connection explained why Campbell had been involved. It explained how Ryan could recruit him. It explained how a second man could travel to New York and participate without appearing to be a random stranger. And Campbell's own plea would eventually confirm the essential facts. The murder had been planned. The carjacking was staged. The blood was deliberately left behind. The Honda was moved. The story was constructed. But the story was never stronger than the evidence. The case also reveals something about the psychology of a staged crime. The people creating the deception have to imagine the investigation from the perspective of police. They have to predict what officers will believe. They have to predict which objects will be noticed. They have to predict how witnesses will react. They have to predict how investigators will reconstruct movement. And they have to predict what science will be capable of proving. That last part is where time becomes dangerous. A plan created in 2009 could not anticipate every forensic comparison that might happen in 2013. The killers could move a car. They could fabricate a story. They could stage injuries. But they could not control the future. Campbell's blood was the future. The database was the future. The match was the future. And when that future arrived, the mystery collapsed. The public story changed. There had never been a random stranger. There had been a conspiracy. There had been planning. There had been an accomplice. And there had been a woman who never got the chance to tell her own story. That is why the title of this case should never be reduced to "The DNA Solved It." DNA did not solve everything. It identified Campbell. The rest of the investigation explained what that identification meant. The phone records connected him to Ryan. The relationship connected him to the plan. The physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. His plea confirmed his role. The DNA was the key. But a key matters only because there is a door. And behind that door was the truth about what happened to Serica Dunkley Holness. The woman who was supposed to disappear into a fabricated story did not. Her name remained. The evidence remained. The investigation remained. And eventually the truth came through. Part 10. In November 2014, Delando Campbell stood before a federal judge and received his sentence. 30 years in prison. 5 years of supervised release. The man whose blood had once been labeled unknown now had a sentence attached to his name. The case had reached a legal conclusion. But legal conclusions do not erase the night of the murder. They do not return a victim. They do not erase the image of a body found beside a rural Maryland road. They do not erase the questions that existed during those first hours. And they do not erase the years during which Campbell remained unidentified. The final outcome is striking because of how many times the investigation could have gone in another direction. If investigators had accepted the carjacking story, the search might have focused on an imaginary stranger. If the blood had not been preserved, Campbell might have remained unknown. If his DNA had never entered the database, the profile might have continued waiting. If the connection between the men had not been established, the significance of the DNA might have been harder to understand. But the pieces came together. The first suspect was convicted. The second suspect was identified. The second suspect pleaded guilty. And the staged crime scene was exposed. The case became an example of the long reach of forensic evidence. 4 years can feel like an eternity. But for DNA, 4 years can be nothing. A biological trace collected in Maryland remained useful long after the crime scene had been cleared. The roads changed. The seasons changed. The investigators moved on to other cases. But the DNA profile remained. And then a routine event in California created the comparison that investigators needed. It is difficult to imagine the moment the match was confirmed. A screen. A laboratory report. A name. Campbell. The unknown man was no longer unknown. The investigation had crossed state lines without the suspect realizing it. Maryland had the crime scene. California had the new sample. The database connected them. The past reached the present. And the story changed. But there is another dimension to the case. The murder was not merely an act of violence. It was an attempt to manipulate memory. The killers wanted everyone to remember a carjacking. They wanted investigators to imagine a masked stranger. They wanted Serica's death to look random. But the truth was targeted. She was not simply in the wrong place. She was the intended victim. The life insurance policy gave the prosecution a financial motive. The repeated communications gave the prosecution evidence of planning. Campbell's travel connected him to the operation. The crime scene connected him physically. And the DNA connected his body to the evidence. The fabricated story could not survive that combination. The case also shows why investigators often return to seemingly small details. The paperback book might look insignificant. A sandal might look like an ordinary object. A purse might seem like another item left at a crime scene. But if a stranger's blood is found on those objects, their meaning changes. Evidence is contextual. One drop can mean nothing. One drop connected to a person can mean everything. And Campbell's blood was not merely present. It was part of the staging. That made the irony even greater. The accomplice helped create the evidence that eventually identified him. The deception contained its own undoing. There is a grim symmetry to that. The plan was supposed to hide the truth. The plan itself created the trail to the truth. The men attempted to control the scene. The scene recorded them instead. They attempted to create a fictional killer. The DNA identified a real one. They attempted to send investigators looking elsewhere. The evidence brought investigators back. And the longer they waited, the more dangerous the evidence became. Because science moves forward. Databases expand. Records accumulate. Techniques improve. And unidentified profiles do not become less valuable simply because they are old. Sometimes they become more valuable. That is what happened here. The mystery did not disappear. It waited. And when the right sample entered the system, it ended. Part 11. There are murder cases that end with a confession. There are cases that end with a weapon. There are cases that end with a witness finally speaking. And then there are cases that end with something much smaller. A drop of blood. The story of Serica Dunkley Holness is one of those cases. On June 5, 2009, she was found dead in a field near Route 290 in Kent County, Maryland. The first explanation was a carjacking. A masked stranger. A forced journey. A husband supposedly attacked and restrained. A woman supposedly killed by someone who disappeared into the night. But investigators kept looking. The husband was charged. The story unraveled. Evidence accumulated. Ryan Holness was eventually convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. But the investigation had another name missing from the file. Unknown male one. That man had left blood behind. His DNA was recovered from the crime scene and from objects connected to Serica. But in 2009, investigators did not know his identity. For 4 years the profile waited. Then California. An unrelated arrest. A routine DNA collection. A database comparison. A match. Delando Ricardo Campbell. The unknown man had been found. And the discovery confirmed what the fabricated carjacking had tried to hide. There was no mysterious stranger. There was an accomplice. Campbell knew Ryan. He had been recruited. He traveled to New York. He participated in the murder plan. He helped create the false appearance of a carjacking. And he deliberately left his blood behind to make that false story more convincing. In July 2014, he pleaded guilty. Months later, he was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison followed by 5 years of supervised release. The case was solved. The second killer had a name. The court had a conviction. But there is something the courtroom could never provide. Could never give Serica back. It could never undo the journey from Brooklyn. It could never erase the field. It could never change the final moments of her life. And perhaps that is why the case remains so unsettling. Because the most terrifying part was not that the killers were clever. They were not. They made mistakes. They left evidence. They created contradictions. They underestimated the future. The terrifying part is that they came close enough to make the truth wait. For 4 years, the unknown man's DNA sat in a database. For 4 years, the identity of the accomplice remained unresolved. 4 years is long enough for people to wonder whether justice will ever come. Then science answered. Quietly. Without warning. Without a dramatic confrontation. A laboratory result connected a California man to a Maryland murder. The blood remembered what the men wanted everyone else to forget. That is the final image of this case. Not the mask. Not the knife. Not the abandoned Honda. Not the false story. The blood. A microscopic trace carrying a biological identity across time. A piece of evidence that did not know the man's name but knew what he was made of. And when the database finally found its match, the past opened. The stranger became Campbell. The mystery became a prosecution. The accomplice became a convicted criminal. And the story of Serica Dunkley Holness became clearer. She was not killed by a random attacker. She was the target of a planned murder. Her husband had arranged for her death. An accomplice had helped. The crime scene had been staged. The carjacking had been fabricated. And the evidence had survived. That last fact matters. Because investigators cannot always solve a murder immediately. Sometimes the truth is incomplete. Sometimes the identity of a suspect is missing. Sometimes the evidence seems to lead nowhere. But missing is not the same as gone. Unknown is not the same as forgotten. And unsolved is not necessarily the same as unsolvable. In Serica's case, the answer was waiting in the evidence. The DNA was there. The profile was there. The record was there. All that was missing was the match. Then the match came. 5 years after the murder, the second killer's identity was no longer a mystery. And the fabricated story that had been built around Serica's death finally collapsed. The road remained. The field remained. The evidence remained. But the lie did not. Today, the case stands as a stark reminder that even carefully staged crimes can leave behind traces their creators cannot control. A phone call. A search. A vehicle. A knife. A drop of blood. Any one of them may seem insignificant. Together they can become a map. And sometimes that map takes years to complete. Serica Dunkley Holness did not get to tell investigators what happened to her. But the evidence did. It spoke through the objects left behind. It spoke through the blood. It spoke through the records. It spoke through the DNA. And eventually, it named the man who had tried to remain invisible. Delando Campbell. The unknown accomplice was found. The husband was convicted. The staged carjacking was exposed. The courtroom closed the case. But the final silence belongs to Serica, a young woman whose life ended beside a Maryland road before sunrise. A woman whose death was almost buried beneath a fabricated story. A woman whose killers believed they could control what the world would believe. They were wrong. Because a story can be invented. Evidence cannot. And sometimes when everyone else has stopped talking, the smallest trace left behind is enough to tell the truth. The case was legally closed, but the questions that surround a murder do not always disappear when the courtroom doors close. Sometimes the verdict is only the final page of a file. The real story remains in everything that happened before it. The phone calls nobody noticed. The journey nobody questioned at first. The insurance policy that seemed ordinary until a woman was dead. The vehicle that was moved. The blood that was planted. The story that was rehearsed. And the tiny biological trace that destroyed it all. For years, the people responsible believed the crime could be reduced to a narrative. A stranger appeared. A stranger attacked. A stranger killed. A stranger disappeared. It was simple. Too simple. Because the truth was much closer. The killer was not some invisible predator passing through Maryland. The killer was connected to Serica's own life. The accomplice was connected to her husband. And the murder had been planned before the three people ever reached that dark road. That realization changes the way the entire case looks. The road is no longer just a road. It becomes the final destination of a plan. The Honda is no longer just a vehicle. It becomes a moving crime scene. The duct tape is no longer evidence of a random kidnapping. It becomes part of an illusion. The blood is no longer evidence of a wounded stranger. It becomes the signature of the man who helped create the deception. And the field is no longer simply where Serica was found. It becomes the place where the false story began to die. Because every crime scene has two stories. The story criminals want investigators to see. And the story the evidence actually tells. Those two stories can appear identical for minutes. Sometimes hours. Sometimes days. But they rarely remain identical forever. In this case, the difference eventually became impossible to ignore. The husband had a motive. The accomplice had a connection. The communications showed preparation. The physical evidence showed presence. The DNA showed identity. And the confession filled in the remaining gaps. The investigators did not need one perfect clue. They needed enough independent pieces to make the deception collapse under its own weight. That is how the truth often emerges. Not like lightning. Like pressure. A little more evidence. Another contradiction. Another record. Another laboratory result. Another question. Until the story that once seemed believable becomes impossible to defend. And perhaps that is what makes this case more frightening than a simple mystery. The danger was not hiding in the darkness. It was hiding inside an ordinary relationship. The threat did not come from a stranger on a deserted road. It came from people Serica knew. That distinction matters. Because random violence creates fear of the unknown. Planned violence by someone close creates something deeper. It destroys the assumption that familiarity means safety. Serica did not know that her husband had taken out a life insurance policy naming himself as beneficiary. She did not know that he was communicating with Campbell in the weeks before her death. She did not know that another man was being brought into a plan. She did not know that the story of a future carjacking was being constructed before the crime occurred. She simply traveled. And somewhere along that journey, the ordinary world disappeared. The investigation later reconstructed pieces of that journey. But reconstruction is never the same as being there. Investigators can establish movements. They can examine evidence. They can determine where a vehicle traveled. They can establish who communicated with whom. They can identify DNA. But they cannot recover the private thoughts of a victim during the final moments of her life. They cannot hear what she heard. They cannot know exactly what she felt when she realized something was wrong. They can only look at what she left behind. Her injuries. Her belongings. Her movements. Her surroundings. And the evidence that remained after the people responsible had gone. That evidence became her voice. The case therefore became more than a prosecution of two men. It became a reconstruction of a life interrupted. A young woman left Brooklyn. She expected to continue living. Instead, her journey ended in Maryland. And the people responsible attempted to turn that ending into a story about a stranger. But the evidence refused to let her death become anonymous. Her name remained attached to the investigation. Her DNA remained part of the evidence. Her belongings remained part of the record. And the unknown man's DNA remained connected to her. For years later, that connection became a name. The name became an arrest. The arrest became a guilty plea. And the plea became a sentence. That chain is the opposite of disappearance. It is the slow return of a truth that someone tried to bury. There is another reason the case continues to resonate. It demonstrates how investigations can change direction without changing the underlying facts. In 2009, investigators knew a murder had occurred. They did not initially know exactly who had planned it. They knew Ryan was claiming to be a victim. They did not yet know whether he was telling the truth. They knew biological evidence from an unknown man existed. They did not know who that man was. Years later, the facts were still the same. Only the identities had changed. The blood had always belonged to Campbell. The phone calls had always happened. The insurance policy had always existed. The vehicle had always been moved. The stage scene had always been staged. The truth had never changed. Only the investigator's ability to see the complete picture had changed. That may be the most important lesson in the entire case. Evidence does not need to reveal everything at once. Sometimes it only needs to survive. A piece of evidence can wait for technology. Can wait for a database. It can wait for another investigation. Can wait for a new sample. It can wait for a suspect to make an unrelated mistake. Campbell's DNA did exactly that. His connection to Serica's murder existed long before investigators knew his name. The biological evidence was there in 2009. The name arrived later. And when it did, the years of uncertainty collapsed quickly. The mystery had never been empty. It had been incomplete. That difference is enormous. Because an empty investigation has nothing to follow. An incomplete investigation has evidence waiting to be connected. Serica's case had evidence. It had plenty. The problem was identifying the person behind one of its most important traces. The national database solved that problem. And when Campbell's DNA matched, the invisible accomplice became visible. The case was no longer about an unknown stranger. It was about two men who had made decisions. Decisions that could not be undone. Decisions that left consequences. Decisions that eventually led to prison. And behind those decisions was the life they had taken. Serica. Her death was planned. Her murder was staged. Her story was manipulated. But her identity could not be erased. That is why the final image of this case should not be the courtroom. It should be the evidence room. A sealed bag. A labeled item. A biological sample. Something so small that a person could overlook it. Yet inside that tiny trace was an answer that would survive 4 years of silence. The men responsible believed the darkness would protect them. It did not. The road was dark. The field was dark. The story was dark. But somewhere in the evidence was a biological signal that could not be intimidated, bribed, persuaded, or forgotten. It simply waited. And when the database found its match, the darkness lost its greatest advantage. Anonymity. The unknown man had a name. The name had a history. The history connected to Ryan. Ryan connected to the plan. The plan connected to the murder. And the murder connected everything back to Serica. A chain completed years after the crime. A chain that began with a life and ended with a sentence. 30 years for Campbell. Life imprisonment for Ryan. But no sentence can measure the value of the life that was taken. No court order can reverse the final journey. No DNA match can undo the violence. Forensic science can identify. Courts can punish. Investigators can reconstruct. But none of them can turn back time. And that is where the story ultimately becomes quiet. After the headlines. After the arrests. After the laboratory reports. After the courtroom. After the sentence. There is still a woman who should have gone home. There is still a family that lost someone. There is still a road in Maryland where the night became permanent memory. And there is still the knowledge that the truth did not arrive immediately. It arrived piece by piece. Slowly. Relentlessly. A contradiction. A record. A trace. A profile. A match. A name. Confession. A sentence. That is how the silence ended. Not with a single dramatic revelation, but with evidence refusing to disappear. The killers tried to create a story in which Serica was the victim of a random stranger. The evidence created a different story. A story of planning. A story of deception. A story of betrayal. A story in which the supposed stranger was an accomplice whose own blood remained behind. And perhaps that is the most chilling conclusion of all. The evidence did not merely identify the man. Prove that he had been there. His body had touched the crime. His blood had entered the scene. And years later, science brought that presence back into the light. The past had not forgotten. The evidence had not forgotten. Serica's name had not disappeared. And the men who believed they could write the final version of her story discovered that they could not. Because the final version was written by the evidence. And evidence, unlike a lie, does not need to be remembered. It only needs to remain. For years passed. The world moved forward. But somewhere inside a database, a silent profile remained. Unknown. Waiting. Then one day another sample arrived. The system compared the profiles. And the silence ended. Delando Ricardo Campbell. A name. Connection. A truth. The invisible accomplice was no longer invisible. The fabricated carjacking was exposed. The second killer was identified. And a case that had once seemed to contain a faceless stranger finally had an answer. Not every mystery survives forever. Some mysteries are simply waiting for the right piece of evidence to find them. In Serica Dunkley Holness's case, that piece of evidence was microscopic. But it carried a name. And eventually it carried the truth. The courtroom eventually became quiet. The lawyers stopped speaking. The evidence had been presented. The arguments had ended. The sentences had been handed down. But somewhere far away from the courtroom, the place where Serica Dunkley Holness was found remained unchanged by the verdict. A rural stretch of Maryland. A road. A field. A place that had once been nothing more than another location on a map. Then, in the early hours of June 5, 2009, it became part of a murder investigation that would cross state lines, survive years of uncertainty, and eventually reveal a second perpetrator through DNA. There is something unsettling about ordinary places becoming crime scenes. Before that night, Route 290 was simply a road. People drove through. Cars passed. The darkness came and went with the seasons. Nobody looking at it would have imagined that the location would become connected forever to a 26-year-old woman whose life was about to end. That is how murder changes geography. A familiar road becomes evidence. A field becomes a memory. A vehicle becomes a forensic object. A discarded item becomes a clue. And a tiny trace of blood becomes a message from the past. Serica's final journey began in New York. She was traveling with Ryan Holness. She did not know that the man beside her had arranged a life insurance policy worth $500,000. She did not know that he had been communicating with Delando Campbell. She did not know that Campbell was being brought into a plan that would end with her death. She could not see the investigation that would follow. She could not know that her death would become a federal case. She could not know that one of the men involved would eventually be sentenced to life. She could not know that another would be identified years later through DNA. But every decision made that night left a trace. The plan had required movement. Movement created records. The plan had required communication. Communication created phone records. The plan had required a staged crime scene. Staging created physical evidence. And the plan had required Campbell to leave blood behind. That created the DNA profile. The men had tried to construct a perfect illusion. But perfection does not exist at a crime scene. There is always something. A detail. A contradiction. A microscopic trace. Something that does not belong. Something that tells investigators the story they are hearing is not the story that happened. That was what happened here. The supposed carjacking began to unravel. The husband became a suspect. The accomplice remained unidentified. But the evidence was already pointing toward him. His blood was there. The profile was there. The identity was simply missing. That distinction is what makes the later DNA match so powerful. The evidence did not suddenly appear in 2013. It had been sitting there since 2009. The truth was present from the beginning. Only the name was missing. Then California supplied it. A routine DNA collection connected Campbell to the old Maryland case. A man living his life years after the murder suddenly became connected to a crime he had tried to bury. That is one of the most powerful realities of forensic investigation. A person can leave a scene. A person can cross a state border. A person can change jobs. Change addresses. Change relationships. Disappear from the immediate attention of investigators. But DNA does not cross into the future the way a person does. It remains where it was left. waiting for comparison, waiting for technology, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle. Campbell's blood had no voice, but the database gave it one. And once his identity was established, the investigation could finally explain why the blood was there. He had not wandered into the crime. He had been involved. He was not a random stranger. He was connected to Ryan. He was part of the plan. The mystery that had once centered on an imaginary attacker became a story about conspiracy and betrayal. And that transformation changed everything. Because the question was no longer, who killed Serica? It became, how long had they been planning it? The evidence showed preparation. The insurance policy existed months before the murder. The communications between Ryan and Campbell occurred in the weeks before the killing. The journey happened. The murder happened. The scene was staged. The vehicle was abandoned. The story was told. Then the evidence began to speak. That sequence is what investigators follow. Not emotion. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Sequence. What happened first? What happened next? Who communicated? Who traveled? Who benefited? Who was present? Who left evidence? And eventually, who was lying? The answers created a picture that was difficult to escape. Ryan had motive. Campbell had involvement. Serica had been targeted. The carjacking was a fabrication. And the DNA connected Campbell physically to the crime. That is why the case could move forward even after years had passed. The evidence had not weakened. If anything, the evidence had become more powerful because the identity it pointed toward had finally been discovered. The passage of time did not erase the blood. It gave investigators a chance to match it. And once the match occurred, the 4-year mystery ended quickly. Campbell was charged. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced. The unknown man had become a convicted participant in Serica's murder. The investigation was complete. But completion is not the same as closure. Families do not experience justice as a laboratory result. They experience it through absence. A missing chair. A silent phone. A birthday that comes every year. A photograph that never changes. A memory of someone who should still be there. For Serica's family, no sentence could restore what had been taken. No courtroom could erase the final night. No DNA match could give them back the years that should have followed. But truth matters. It matters because lies can become permanent if nobody challenges them. The men responsible attempted to create a permanent lie. They wanted the world to believe that Serica had been killed by a stranger. They wanted Ryan to appear helpless. They wanted Campbell to disappear. For a time the plan seemed to work. Then the evidence caught up. That is the part of the case that deserves to be remembered. Not simply that DNA identified Campbell, but that the evidence survived the lie. The blood survived. The records survived. The physical evidence survived. The investigation survived. And eventually the truth survived. The story of Serica Dunkley Holness is therefore not a story about a perfect murder. It is a story about an imperfect deception. A deception with too many moving parts. Too many records. Too many traces. Too many contradictions. And one biological signature that could not be erased. The men had attempted to control what investigators saw. But investigators kept looking beyond what they were being shown. That is where the case changed. The supposed victim was investigated. The supposed attacker was questioned. The supposed restraints were examined. The supposed crime scene was reconstructed. And the supposed stranger was eventually revealed as a real man with a real name. That process took time. But time did not destroy the evidence. It strengthened the possibility that one day the unknown would become known. And it did. For years. One DNA sample. One database match. One name. That is all it took to reopen a door that had never truly been closed. And behind that door was the truth about Delando Campbell. The truth about Ryan Holness. And the truth about Serica. A woman whose final journey was designed to become a mystery. But it did not. Because the mystery had a flaw. The killers could invent a stranger. They could move a car. They could stage injuries. They could create a false story. But they could not control biology. They could not control the database. They could not control the future. And they could not control what investigators would discover years later. That is why the smallest piece of evidence became the most important. A drop of blood. Not dramatic. Not visible from a distance. Not powerful enough to frighten anyone. Yet capable of surviving years. Capable of crossing state lines. Capable of connecting a California DNA sample to a Maryland murder. Capable of turning unknown male 1 into Delando Ricardo Campbell. Capable of destroying a lie. And capable of ensuring that Serica's death would not remain hidden behind a fictional carjacking. The road is still there. The field is still there. The memory is still there. And somewhere in the history of that case is the quiet reminder that a crime scene never belongs entirely to the people who create it. It belongs to the evidence. Every object can speak. Every movement can leave a record. Every lie can create a contradiction. And every biological trace can carry a secret far longer than the person who left it behind. Serica could not speak for herself. So the evidence spoke. The evidence said someone had been there. The evidence said the stranger was not a stranger. The evidence said the story was false. And years later, the evidence gave investigators a name. Delando Campbell. The unknown accomplice was no longer unknown. The case that began in darkness eventually reached the light. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But piece by piece. A name. A match. Confession. A sentence. And finally, silence. Not the silence of an unsolved murder. The silence that comes after the truth has been established. A silence in which there are no more imaginary attackers to search for. No more mysterious stranger. No more unanswered question about who the second man was. Only the memory of a woman who should still have been alive. And the knowledge that, despite every attempt to disguise what happened, the truth remained. Waiting. Hidden in the smallest trace. Waiting for science. Waiting for the right comparison. Waiting for the day when an unknown profile would finally become a human name. And when that day came, the past did what the killers never expected it to do. Came back. It found them. And it spoke. Years after the murder, the most important witness was still sitting inside a laboratory database. Could not speak. Could not remember. It could not point toward a suspect. But it carried something far more reliable than memory. Identity. The blood collected from the crime scene belonged to a man investigators did not know. And that fact had remained unchanged since the night Serica Dunkley Holness was killed. The years passed. The investigation moved through courtrooms. Ryan Holness was convicted. The public learned that the carjacking had been staged. But somewhere beyond the headlines, another question remained. Who was the second man? For investigators, that question was not abstract. They had his biological profile. They knew he had been close enough to the victim and the vehicle to leave blood behind. They knew the profile was connected to the crime. But they did not yet know the person. That is the strange reality of forensic evidence. Sometimes investigators know exactly what they are looking for without knowing who they are looking for. A name can be missing. A face can be missing. An address can be missing. But the evidence can still be waiting. And waiting is exactly what this DNA profile did. It waited through 2009. It waited through 2010. It waited through 2011. It waited through 2012. Then came 2013. A new DNA sample entered the system. Delando Ricardo Campbell. A man who had once been nothing more than a name in Ryan Holness's circle. A man whose connection to the murder had remained hidden. A man whose blood was already inside the evidence. The database made the connection. The unknown profile was no longer unknown. And suddenly, investigators could look backward. That is when the old records became more dangerous. The phone calls. The text messages. The military connection. The trip to New York. The journey to Maryland. The staged crime scene. The abandoned Honda. Everything that had once appeared disconnected now had a center. Campbell. The DNA match did not stand alone. It fit into a structure that had already begun to emerge. That is what made it so powerful. If Campbell's DNA had appeared with no other connection to the case, investigators would still have questions. But his relationship with Ryan changed the meaning. The communications changed the meaning. His presence changed the meaning. And his eventual admission changed everything. The stranger had never been a stranger. He had been invited. He had been involved. He had been part of the plan. The murder was not a random explosion of violence. It was an arranged event. A victim was selected. A story was prepared. An accomplice was recruited. A scene was staged. And then the plan went into motion. But no plan survives contact with reality perfectly. Reality leaves fingerprints. Reality leaves blood. Reality leaves records. And reality remembers. The men responsible had attempted to create a version of events in which Serica's death could be blamed on someone passing through. But they underestimated the number of people and systems that would eventually examine the crime. Police examined the scene. Forensic specialists examined the evidence. Investigators examined the vehicle. Prosecutors examined the timeline. Telephone records were examined. Financial records were examined. And the DNA was preserved. Every layer brought the false story closer to collapse. The case became a demonstration of cumulative evidence. One clue rarely solves a murder. But one clue can open the door. The DNA opened the door to Campbell. Campbell opened the door to his relationship with Ryan. That relationship opened the door to the planning. The planning explained the trip. The trip explained the presence. The presence explained the blood. And the blood brought the entire story back to the crime scene. That is how investigators reconstruct a case. Backward. From the evidence. From the consequences. From the traces left after the people responsible have gone. The killers knew what they wanted investigators to believe. But they could not know everything investigators would eventually discover. They could not know how technology would develop. They could not know when a DNA comparison would become possible. They could not know that an unrelated arrest in California would bring their old crime back into focus. And they certainly could not know that the blood they deliberately left behind would eventually identify one of them. That is the irony that refuses to disappear. Campbell's blood was supposed to make the fake carjacking more believable. Instead, it made Campbell identifiable. The evidence they created to strengthen the lie became the evidence that destroyed it. And that is why this case is remembered not only for the violence of the murder, but for the extraordinary way the truth survived. The murder happened in darkness. The evidence was collected in darkness. The identity remained hidden in darkness. But darkness is not the same as disappearance. The DNA was there. Waiting. The database was there. waiting. The investigators were there, waiting. And eventually the right name appeared. The moment that happened, the case changed forever. Campbell was no longer an unidentified participant. He was a man investigators could locate. A man prosecutors could charge. A man who could be brought before a judge. A man who could be confronted with evidence that had survived for years. And when he pleaded guilty, the mystery surrounding the second participant finally ended. But Serica's story had already become something larger than the courtroom. It had become a warning about the limits of deception. A warning that a carefully constructed story can collapse because of something so small that nobody notices it at first. A drop of blood. A trace on an object.
À microscopique biologicale signature.
Something invisible to the naked eye. Something that does not look like justice. Yet sometimes it is. The killers wanted the public to see a stranger. The evidence showed an accomplice. They wanted the husband to look helpless. The evidence showed planning. They wanted the murder to look random. The evidence showed motive. They wanted the investigation to end at the roadside. The evidence carried it across state lines. And they wanted time to bury what they had done. Time did the opposite. Time gave investigators another chance. It gave technology another chance. It gave the database another chance. And eventually, it gave Serica's family another piece of the truth. No sentence can restore a life. But truth can restore something else. It can restore reality. It can prevent a victim's final moments from being defined by a lie. Serica was not simply the victim of a random carjacking. She was targeted. Her death was planned. And the men responsible were identified. That distinction matters. Because a fabricated crime scene attempts to steal something from the victim even after death. It attempts to rewrite the circumstances. It attempts to turn intention into randomness. It attempts to turn murder into misfortune. The investigation refused to allow that rewrite. The truth survived. Not because the killers told it. Because the evidence did. And evidence has no reason to protect anyone. It does not care about friendship. It does not care about money. It does not care about reputation. It does not care about the story someone tells police. It simply remains. A bloodstain remains a bloodstain. A phone record remains a phone record. A financial transaction remains a financial transaction. A DNA profile remains a DNA profile. And eventually those facts can converge. When they do, the story becomes impossible to control. That is what happened here. The case began with a husband claiming to be a victim. It ended with two men being held responsible. It began with a supposed stranger. It ended with a name. It began with a lie. It ended with evidence. And in between those points was Serica, 26 years old. Alive at the beginning of the journey. Dead before sunrise. Her killers believed they could control the explanation. They were wrong. Because they could control the scene only for a moment. They could not control what the scene would reveal years later. The road remained silent. The field remained silent. The evidence did not. It waited. And when the time came, it spoke. It said that someone else had been there. It said that the blood belonged to Delando Campbell. It said that the stranger was real, but not the stranger the story had described. And it forced the past into the present. That is the final power of a cold case investigation. The passage of time does not always make a crime disappear. Sometimes it makes the eventual discovery even more devastating. Because by the time the truth arrives, everyone has already had years to believe the lie. Then one piece of evidence changes everything. One match. One name. One answer. And suddenly, the story everyone thought they knew becomes the story they can never forget. Serica's murder was no longer an unexplained attack on a dark Maryland road. It was a planned killing. The supposed carjacking was a cover. The unknown man had an identity, and the smallest trace at the scene had carried that identity across 4 years of silence. The killers had tried to leave no story behind. Instead, they left one. And it was written in blood. There was a moment in the investigation when the murder stopped being a collection of unanswered questions and became a sequence of facts. The transformation did not happen in the field. It did not happen beside the abandoned Honda. It did not happen when investigators first questioned Ryan Holness. It happened later, when the evidence from different moments began pointing toward the same conclusion. The insurance policy, the communications, the journey, the staged scene, the blood, the DNA match, and eventually the guilty plea. Each piece had existed separately. Then they began to connect. That is when a mystery becomes a case. And that is when a carefully constructed lie becomes dangerous for the people who created it. Because a lie depends on isolation. One explanation for one detail. Another explanation for another. A different explanation for a third. But investigators do not examine evidence separately forever. They build timelines. They compare statements. They test physical evidence. They look for connections. And connections were everywhere. Ryan had a reason to want Serica dead. Campbell had a connection to Ryan. Campbell communicated with Ryan repeatedly before the murder. Campbell traveled to New York. Campbell became connected to the crime scene through DNA. The vehicle was moved. The carjacking story was staged. The pieces did not simply fit. They reinforced one another. And once Campbell's identity emerged, the case took on a completely different shape. Before the DNA match, investigators had an unknown biological profile. After the match, they had a person. That difference cannot be overstated. An unidentified DNA profile can tell investigators that someone was there. A matched profile can tell them who. But even then, investigators must determine what that presence means. A DNA match is not automatically a complete explanation of a crime. It is a door. Investigators still have to walk through it. In Campbell's case, what they found on the other side was a relationship with Ryan Holness and evidence of communication surrounding the murder. The name was no longer isolated. It had context. And context is what transformed the laboratory result into a prosecution. The man whose blood had been discovered in Maryland had connections to the man already convicted of killing Serica. The supposed stranger had not appeared by accident. He had been brought into the story. The random attacker was not random. The investigation had finally reached the point where the original narrative could no longer survive. And yet, there is something almost tragic about how long the evidence had to wait. For 4 years, the profile could not tell investigators where Campbell was. It could not tell them what he had done. It could not tell them why he had been involved. Simply existed. A biological fact without a name. Then another investigation created the missing piece. That is the unpredictable nature of forensic science. The case that solves one mystery can sometimes solve another. The sample collected for an unrelated reason can become the key to an old murder. A person can believe an old crime has disappeared while their identity is quietly sitting inside a database. Campbell's case became exactly that. The murder was in Maryland. The new DNA sample was in California. The connection was national. The crime had crossed state lines long before investigators understood how. And when the match arrived, the distance no longer mattered. California was connected to Maryland. 2013 was connected to 2009. Campbell was connected to the crime scene. And the unknown man finally had a face. That is what makes DNA so unsettling for anyone who believes distance can provide protection. Person can leave a state. They can leave a city. They can leave the immediate circle of investigators, but they cannot leave behind the biological evidence already deposited at a crime scene. The blood remains where it was left. The profile remains in the laboratory, and the database waits. The case also shows why investigators preserve evidence, even when they do not immediately know what it means. At first, the blood was simply an unidentified male profile. It did not solve the murder, but it was preserved. Years later, it became one of the most important pieces of the entire investigation. This is how cold case science works at its most fundamental level. Evidence does not have to be understood immediately to be valuable. It only has to survive. Time can change the circumstances surrounding a case, but it does not necessarily change the evidence itself. And that was the nightmare for Campbell. The crime was years old, but the evidence against him was still alive. When investigators finally confronted him with the case, the mystery had already been narrowed dramatically. He knew Ryan. He had been communicating with him. He had traveled to New York. His DNA was linked to the crime scene, and prosecutors had evidence describing his role in the plan. There was nowhere for the imaginary stranger to go, because the stranger had never existed. There was only Campbell, and there was only the truth. His eventual guilty plea meant the case no longer depended entirely on a jury reconstructing every detail. He admitted his involvement. The man who had been invisible in 2009 was standing in court in 2014. The timeline had closed, but the emotional timeline was different. For Serica's family, 4 years had not been a laboratory experiment. They were 4 years without her. 4 years of birthdays. 4 years of unanswered questions. 4 years of remembering the woman she had been before the murder. Justice can arrive years after a crime. But grief does not wait for justice. Grief begins immediately. That is one of the uncomfortable truths hidden behind every cold case headline. When investigators say a case is solved, the word describes the investigation. It does not describe the victim's life. It does not describe the family's pain. It does not mean the past has been erased. It means the truth has been established. And in Serica's case, the truth was brutally clear. She was not killed by a random stranger. Her husband was not an innocent survivor. The crime was planned. An accomplice was involved. The scene was staged. And DNA eventually identified the second man. That truth mattered because the alternative would have remained a lie. The alternative would have made Serica's murder look like a random tragedy. It would have suggested that she simply happened to cross paths with violence. But she did not. She was targeted. Her death had been deliberately arranged. And the men responsible tried to hide that fact behind a fictional attacker. The investigation stripped away the fiction, layer by layer. The insurance policy removed one layer. The communications removed another. The physical evidence removed another. The DNA removed another. The plea removed the last. And underneath everything was the same terrible reality. A young woman's life had been deliberately taken. The case is therefore not really about how clever the killers were. It is about how fragile their deception was. They had assumed that the scene could tell the story they wanted. But crime scenes do not belong to the people who stage them. They belong to reality. Reality is messy. Reality leaves contradictions. Reality leaves traces. Reality cannot be rehearsed. And reality eventually catches up. The field could not speak. The Honda could not speak. The knife could not speak. The blood could not speak. But together they formed a language. Investigators learned how to read it. And eventually, that language identified Campbell. There is a final irony in the fact that the blood was deliberately placed. The accomplice attempted to use biology as theater. He wanted investigators to see a wounded stranger. Instead, he gave them his identity. He created the clue that would eventually point back to himself. That is the kind of mistake that can remain invisible for years. Nobody looking at a tiny bloodstain in 2009 could know exactly when it would become important. But evidence does not need to know the future. It only needs to remain intact. The future does the rest. And so the case of Serica Dunkley Holness became a story about time. Time between the murder and the conviction. Time between the unidentified DNA profile and the match. Time between the lie and the truth. Time between the night Serica died and the day her killers were held accountable. 4 years separated the crime from the identification of Campbell. But the evidence never accepted that separation. It remained connected. Waiting. The past had not disappeared. It had simply gone quiet. Then the DNA match came. And the silence broke. A name emerged. A second perpetrator was identified. A guilty plea followed. A sentence followed. The investigation reached its legal conclusion. But the road remained. The field remained. The memory remained. And so did the lesson. A crime can be staged. A story can be invented. A stranger can be created on paper. But evidence has no obligation to follow the script. It follows reality. And reality eventually wins. That is what happened to the carefully constructed story surrounding Serica Dunkley Holness. It began as a tale of a random attack. It ended as evidence of a planned murder. It began with an unknown stranger. It ended with Delando Ricardo Campbell. It began with a lie designed to survive. It ended with a DNA match that survived longer. And perhaps that is the image that should remain after all the courtroom testimony has faded. Not the headlines. Not the photographs of police cars. Not the legal arguments. But a microscopic trace sitting quietly in evidence. A trace that waited 4 years. A trace that crossed no borders itself, yet connected 2 states. A trace that had no voice, yet eventually told investigators exactly what they needed to know. The blood was there from the beginning. The truth was there from the beginning. The only thing missing was the name. Then the name arrived. And once it did, there was nowhere left for the lie to hide.